Fort Benson, Arizona Territory. August 14th, 1923, evening light. The old man sat in his rocking chair on the ranch house porch watching the sun paint the western mountains in shades of copper and gold. Caleb Wright was 92 years old, his hands gnarled like mesquite roots, his face carved by decades of Arizona wind and sun. Beside him stood his great-grandson Thomas, 17 years old and stiff in his brand-new Army uniform. "You ship out tomorrow morning," Caleb said. His voice carried the rasp of age but remained steady. "Yes, sir. 6 o'clock train to Fort Huachuca." The old man reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a gold pocket watch. Not his own. He had carried it for 45 years, but it had never belonged to him. "Before you go to war, boy, I want to tell you about promises. Not the kind you speak with your mouth, but the kind you keep with your whole life." Thomas shifted his weight the way young men do when they sense a story coming. Caleb smiled faintly, remembering another young man a lifetime ago. This story starts 45 years back on an August day, so hot you could fry an egg on the stones. The watch caught the fading sunlight as Caleb opened it. Inside, a photograph of a young woman with defiant green eyes stared back across the decades. "Let me tell you about the day I met your great-grandmother." The old man's eyes drifted closed. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory, pulling both of them backward through time to a dusty street and a gunshot that changed everything. Fort Benson, Arizona Territory. August 15th, 1878. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The gunshot cracked across Main Street like a whip scattering dust and startling the horses tied outside Harmon's general store. Caleb Wright didn't flinch. At 47 years old and 3 years a widower, he had learned that most gunfire in Fort Benson meant drunken disputes, not an actual danger. He continued loading 50-pound sacks of flour into his Studebaker wagon, the muscles in his back complaining about the weight and the relentless heat. The temperature had climbed past 100 degrees. No breeze moved through the town. The air hung thick and still, pressing down on everything like a wool blanket soaked in sweat. Caleb's shirt stuck to his spine, his hat brim dark with perspiration. Under the wagon seat, his Winchester Model 1873 rifle rested within easy reach, loaded with .44-40 ammunition. A man didn't travel these roads unarmed, even in 1878. Two men were shouting at each other outside the Lucky Star Saloon, their argument carrying clear across the width of Main Street. Something about a poker hand and accusations of marked cards. One of them pulled a Colt Navy revolver and fired into the sky. The shot echoed off the false-fronted buildings. Sheriff Tom Morrison came running from his office, hand on his own weapon, already moving to separate the combatants before real blood got spilled. Caleb paid the disturbance little attention. He had seen this scene play out a dozen times before. Same saloon, different fools. What made him pause mid-lift with a flour sack balanced on his shoulder was not the gunshot, but the sound of a woman's voice rising sharp with anger from across the street. "And don't you dare come back here begging for charity." Mrs. Pemberton's voice could strip paint at 20 paces. Caleb turned toward Pemberton's boarding house and saw the kind of scene that made his jaw tighten and his hands curl into fists. A young woman stood on the boarding house steps, pulled there by Mr. Pemberton's grip on her arm. She wasn't fighting him, she wasn't screaming or crying or begging. She simply stood there with her head up and her shoulders back, clutching a worn carpet bag while Mrs. Pemberton's voice rained down judgment from the porch above. Caleb watched as Pemberton shoved the girl down the 3 wooden steps. She stumbled, but caught herself, never losing hold of that carpet bag, never dropping her eyes to the ground. Something in that simple act of dignity, amid humiliation, made Caleb's chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Recognition. This girl knew what it meant to keep your spine straight when the world tried to break you. She looked to be in her early 20s. Dark blonde hair pinned up, but coming loose from the rough handling. A simple navy cotton dress and with a white apron, both clean but showing signs of hard use and many washings. Her face held the kind of weariness that came not from age, but from carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. Mrs. Pemberton stood on the porch like an avenging angel, her considerable bulk blocking the doorway, her face flushed red with righteous anger. "I run a respectable establishment, and I will not have women of questionable character under my roof." The young woman turned back to face her accuser. Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly enough for half the street to hear. "I told you, Mrs. Pemberton, That man was lying. I never stole anything from anyone. That's what they all say, Mrs. Pemberton's voice dripped with contempt. Mr. Garrett is a respected member of this community, and when he says you took his gold watch, I believe him over some vagrant girl who could barely afford her room. Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut at the mention of Silas Garrett's name. He looked up instinctively toward the balcony of the Lucky Star Saloon. There, standing in the shade with a glass of whiskey in one hand, Silas Garrett watched the scene below with the satisfied smile of a man who had just won a particularly enjoyable game. He was in his early 40s, dark hair slicked back with pomade mustache trimmed to perfection. He wore a black silk vest over a white shirt, gold watch chain gleaming across his belly like a badge of prosperity. Everything about Silas Garrett announced wealth and position and the kind of confidence that came from knowing the world would bend to accommodate him. Caleb had seen that look on Silas's face before. 3 years ago, directed at a young waitress named Alice who worked at the hotel restaurant. Silas had made advances. Alice had refused. Within a week, Silas claimed she had stolen $50 from his store's cash box. The girl had been driven out of town with nothing but shame and accusations following her. 6 months after that, a widow named Judith, who owned a small dress shop. Silas had proposed marriage. She had declined politely. Suddenly, rumors spread that she was carrying on an improper relationship with the man who drove the supply wagons. The widow had closed her shop and left Arizona rather than face the constant whispers and stares. And now this girl. The pattern was clear to anyone who cared to see it. But Silas Garrett owned 25% of the Bank of Fort Benson. He sat on the town council. When he spoke, people listened. When he made accusations, people believed. The young woman adjusted her grip on the carpetbag and started walking down Main Street with no apparent destination. The afternoon sun hammered down without mercy. Even from across the street, Caleb could see her beginning to sway on her feet, the heat and stress taking their toll. She had nowhere to go, no friends to turn to, no family to take her in, just $12 in her pocket if she was lucky, and the clothes on her back. Caleb stood beside his wagon, a half-loaded flour sack still balanced on his shoulder, and felt the familiar war begin inside him. The war between the man he had been and the man he had become since Emma's death. The old Caleb, the man who had lived before that terrible night 3 years ago, would already be crossing the street, would already be offering help. Emma had taught him that, had shown him through her own generous spirit that a person's worth was measured not by what they accumulated, but by what they gave away when it mattered. But the new Caleb, the one who had buried his wife and infant son in a single grave, and then buried his heart right alongside them, knew that getting involved meant risk. Risk of pain, risk of loss, risk of caring about something that could be taken away. It was safer to keep his head down, do his business, and go home to his empty house and his bottle of whiskey. He thought of Emma's voice clear as a bell in his memory. Caleb, if you have the power to help someone, and you don't, you're no better than the ones who hurt them in the first place. The flour sack grew heavier. The heat pressed down. Caleb watched the girl walk away from everything, her head still high, despite having nothing left to hold high for. And in that moment, seeing her refuse to be broken, he saw Emma. Not physically. Emma had been dark-haired where this girl was blonde, petite, where this girl was taller. But that core of steel, that determination to face the world with dignity, no matter what it threw at you, that was pure Emma. 3 years he had been alone. 3 years of waking to an empty bed and eating meals that tasted like sawdust and working until his body ached too much to think. 3 years of existing but not living. Maybe Emma would want him to help this girl. Maybe she would want him to remember what it felt like to be part of the world instead of hiding from it. The decision made itself. Caleb set down the flour sack, wiped his hands on his pants, removed his hat, and crossed Main Street. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. He was aware of people watching. Mrs. Pemberton still stood on the boarding house porch. Silas Garrett still observed from his balcony perch. Sheriff Morrison had finished separating the poker players and now watched Caleb's approach with curious eyes. "Excuse me, miss," Caleb called out. His voice came out rougher than he intended. 3 years of minimal conversation had left his vocal cords rusty with disuse. The girl turned to face him, and for the first time Caleb looked directly into her eyes. Green, the color of new grass after spring rain. exhausted and wary but still holding that spark of defiance that he had noticed from across the street. Those eyes assessed him quickly, cataloging details, measuring threat levels, making calculations about what kind of danger this new man might represent. "If you're here to gawk or add to my troubles, I'd appreciate it if you just let me be on my way," she said. Her voice carried a slight southern lilt, Georgia or maybe Alabama, the kind of accent that marked her as far from home. She held herself very still, ready to run if necessary, ready to fight if running wasn't an option. Caleb recognized the stance of someone who had learned the hard way that the world was not a safe place for women alone. He pulled off his hat, suddenly conscious of how he must look after a morning's work. Dust covered him from head to boots. Sweat had drawn dark lines down his shirt. His face bore 3 days of stubble because he couldn't be bothered to shave for a trip to town. His dark brown hair needed cutting, curling over his collar in a way Emma would have scolded him about. "No, ma'am, nothing like that." He met her eyes directly, letting her see his sincerity. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation, and I wanted to offer some help if you'd be willing to accept it." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of help?" "I've got a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. Small operation, just me and my cattle. I've got a spare room that's been sitting empty for years now. You're welcome to it, no strings attached until you can get yourself sorted out." The girl studied him for a long moment. Caleb could practically see her weighing options. He knew how it looked. A strange man offering a room to a woman in distress. Every instinct she had must be screaming warnings. But he also knew that Fort Benson wasn't exactly overflowing with opportunities for women on their own, especially women accused of theft by powerful men. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "You don't know me from Adam." Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to see this through. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone with nowhere to turn, and I don't believe for a second that you stole anything from Silas Garrett." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You know about that small town miss? Word gets around even to those of us who prefer to keep to ourselves." He gestured with his hat toward the Lucky Star Saloon where Silas still watched. "That man's been known to make false accusations when women refuse his advances." The surprise on her face deepened into something like hope, quickly suppressed, as if hope was too dangerous to allow. "You know, enough to know he's lying." Caleb turned his attention back to her. "I've got to finish loading up my supplies, but after that I'm heading back to the ranch. You are welcome to come along if you want. If not, I understand, but the offer stands." She bit her lip, clearly wrestling with the decision. The sun beat down on both of them. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The normal sounds of the town continuing, while this small drama played out, went largely unnoticed, except by those few who stood watching. Caleb waited patiently. He wouldn't push. This had to be her choice. While they stood there, Silas Garrett descended from the saloon balcony. He moved with the casual arrogance of a man who owned half the town and controlled the rest. From his vest pocket, he withdrew a gold pocket watch, the very watch he claimed this girl had stolen. He made a show of checking the time, his eyes fixed on Caleb and the girl the entire time, that satisfied smile never leaving his face. The message was clear. "I still have it. I never lost it, and I will destroy anyone who stands against me." Caleb felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. Beside him, he heard the girl's sharp intake of breath. "That's the watch," she whispered. "The one he said I stole." "I see it," Caleb said quietly. The girl looked up and down Main Street, taking in the curious stares of passing townsfolk who had witnessed her eviction. Caleb could see the moment she made her decision. Resignation and relief warred in her expression. But beneath both of those, he caught a glimpse of something else. Determination. This girl might be down, but she wasn't defeated. "All right, Mr. Wright, Caleb Wright. Mr. Wright, I accept your offer, but I want to make it clear that I'm not looking for charity. If I'm going to stay in your spare room, I'll work to earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden, whatever you need." Relief flooded through Caleb with surprising intensity. He nodded, not trusting himself to examine too closely why this woman's acceptance mattered so much. "Fair enough. Let me finish up with my supplies and we'll be on our way." "My name is Grace Morgan," she said, "and I didn't steal that watch. Mr. Garrett tried to force himself on me when I was cleaning his room yesterday. When I fought him off, he must have decided to get his revenge by accusing me of theft. I believe you, Miss Morgan, Caleb said simply. And I give you my word that I'm offering nothing more than a safe place to stay. You can lock your door at night if it makes you feel more comfortable. Grace, she said, if we're going to be living under the same roof even temporarily, you should call me Grace. Then you should call me Caleb. The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour and a half. The wagon, heavy with supplies, moved slowly over the rough road. The two horses, pulling at geldings named Buck and Dancer, plodded along at a steady pace that ate up the miles without rushing. Grace sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, her carpet bag clutched in her lap. She kept her back straight, despite what must have been bone-deep exhaustion. Caleb stole occasional glances at her, noticing small details he had missed in town. The way she held herself spoke of good breeding and education despite her current circumstances. The slight southern lilt to her voice suggested refinement. Her hands, though work rough and moved with a kind of unconscious grace that came from being taught proper deportment. This was not a girl born to poverty, though poverty had clearly found her. The landscape rolled past them in shades of brown and red and dusty green. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, some reaching 30 feet into the cloudless sky. The Dragoon Mountains rose to the east, the whetstones to the west. Dust devils danced across the flats, miniature tornadoes of sand and wind that appeared and vanished without warning. How long have you been in Fort Benson? Caleb asked, more to break the silence than out of curiosity. 3 months, Grace replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I came out from Georgia after my father died. There wasn't anything left for me there, and I'd heard there were opportunities out west for people willing to work hard. That's true enough, though it's harder for women on their own. I'm learning that. She turned to look at him directly. What about you? Have you been here long? Caleb felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with talking about the past. Born and raised about 20 miles from here. My father had a ranch bigger than mine. When he died, I split the land with my brother Robert. He took the larger portion since he had a family to support. I moved to this property with my wife about 5 years ago. He saw her glance at his left hand, noting the absence of a wedding ring. Caleb had stopped wearing it 2 years after Emma's death, when the weight of it had become too much to bear. I'm a widower, he said simply. 3 years now. I'm sorry for your loss. Caleb nodded his thanks, not trusting himself to say more. The grief had dulled with time, but it was still there. Every night when he sat at their kitchen table alone, at the spot where he had always sat while Emma sat across from him. Every morning when he woke to an empty bed. Every meal eaten in silence. Every conversation he wanted to have with no one to have it with. 3 years of half-living. 3 years of going through the motions. Wake up, feed the horses, check the cattle, eat something from a tin, drink enough whiskey to sleep, repeat. His brother Robert had tried to draw him back into society. Sunday dinners, church socials, introductions to widows and spinsters who might make suitable second wives. Caleb had refused them all. It was safer to be alone. You couldn't lose what you never allowed yourself to have. But now, sitting beside this young woman with her green eyes and her stubborn refusal to be broken, Caleb felt something stirring in the depths of his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. They rode in silence for another mile before Grace spoke again. What's the land worth out here per acre, I mean? The question surprised him. Depends. Good land with water rights, maybe $5 to $7 an acre. Desert land like this, maybe 2 or 3. And cattle. Right now, a healthy steer runs about $25 to $30. Horses, depending on breeding, $50 to $150. Grace nodded clearly, doing calculations in her head. So a ranch with 320 acres and 80 head of cattle would be worth approximately... Caleb couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his mouth. You know your figures. My father taught me. He said women needed to understand business as much as men, that depending on someone else to handle your money was foolish. After he died and I saw how little was actually left, I wished I'd paid even closer attention. They crested a small rise and the ranch came into view. Not much to look at, Caleb knew, but he had built most of it with his own hands and took pride in what he had accomplished. A single-story wood-frame house with a covered porch. A red barn that could stable 6 horses. Corrals made from rough-cut timber. A windmill, its 8-foot blades turning slowly in the faint breeze, pumping water from 45 feet below ground. Beyond that, the land stretched toward distant mountains, 320 acres of desert and scrub and possibility. It's lovely, Grace said, and Caleb heard genuine appreciation in her voice. You've built yourself a good life here. I've tried, Caleb said, though I'll admit it's been harder to maintain since Emma passed. One person can only do so much. He pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, then moved to help Grace. His hands circled her waist as he lifted her to the ground. He tried not to notice how small she felt, how fragile despite the steel in her spine. Tried not to notice the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the day's heat and troubles. It had been 3 years since he had been this close to a woman, and he found himself unsettled by his reaction. The inside of the house was clean but sparse. Minimal furniture. No decorations. The bare necessities of survival and nothing more. Caleb had never been one for frippery, and after Emma's death he had packed away most of her things, unable to bear the constant reminders. The spare room is down the hall, second door on the right, he said, setting her carpet bag down inside the door. It's got a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. Not much else, I'm afraid, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak. Grace smiled for the first time since he had met her, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest at the sight. After sleeping in that boarding house with its thin walls and thinner mattress, this sounds like luxury. He showed her to the room, which did indeed look sparse and unlived in. The bed was made with military precision. A layer of dust covered the dresser top. The single window looked out over the neglected vegetable garden. Caleb felt suddenly embarrassed at the state of it, wishing he had thought to at least open the window and air it out. I'll leave you to get settled, he said. There's a well out back for fresh water, and the privy is the small building to the left of the barn. I need to unload the wagon and tend to the animals, but after that I can show you around properly if you'd like. Thank you, Caleb. Truly, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't offered to help. Caleb nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude, and retreated to the familiar territory of physical labor. He unloaded the supplies from the wagon, unhitched Buck and Dancer, and set about his evening chores. But his mind kept wandering back to the woman now occupying his spare room. He hadn't brought anyone into his life since Emma's death, had barely spoken to anyone beyond what was necessary for business. It was easier to be alone, easier not to risk the kind of pain that came with caring too much. But something about Grace Morgan had penetrated the walls he had built around himself. Maybe it was the way she had refused to cry or beg when Mrs. Pemberton threw her out. Maybe it was the determination he had seen in her eyes, the refusal to be beaten down by circumstances. Or maybe Caleb thought as he forked hay into the horses' stalls, it was simply that he was tired of being alone. Inside the house, Grace sat on the edge of the bed in her new room, fighting back tears she had refused to shed in public. The events of the past 24 hours had left her shaken and uncertain, but she wouldn't give Silas Garrett or Mrs. Pemberton the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The room was simple but clean. More importantly, it was safe. She could feel it in her bones, the same intuition that had warned her away from Silas Garrett's wandering hands. Caleb Wright was exactly what he appeared to be, a lonely man who understood what it meant to need help and was willing to offer it without expecting anything in return. Grace unpacked her meager belongings. 2 spare dresses hung in the small closet. Her few personal items arranged themselves on the dresser, a daguerreotype of her father, stern-faced and proud in his Sunday suit. Her mother's worn Bible, the pages soft with years of handling. The cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. It wasn't much to show for 22 years of life, but it was hers. She moved to the window and looked out at the ranch. Caleb worked in the fading light, his movements efficient and practiced. Tall and lean, his frame showed the hard muscle that came from years of manual labor. Not handsome in the classical sense. His face was too weathered, his features too rough for that. But there was something appealing about him nonetheless. A quiet strength and steadiness that she found reassuring. A knock on her door startled her from her thoughts. Grace, I'm about to start on some supper, if you're hungry. She opened the door to find Caleb standing in the hallway looking awkward and uncertain. It occurred to her that this was probably the first time he had had anyone else in his house since his wife died. I'd love some supper, but please let me cook. You've done enough for me already. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but then he nodded. All right, I'll warn you though, my supplies are pretty basic. I'm not much for fancy cooking. Basic is fine, Grace assured him. I can make something good out of just about anything. The kitchen was at the back of the house, a functional space with a cast iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves lined with simple provisions. Grace assessed what was available. Flour in a burlap sack, salt pork in a barrel, dried beans both pinto and kidney, Arbuckle's coffee pre-roasted and ready to grind, a jug of molasses, lard in a stoneware crock, baking soda and salt, no fresh vegetables, the garden outside having gone to seed, not much but enough. Grace set to work, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been cooking since childhood. She made biscuits from scratch, cutting cold lard into flour until it resembled coarse meal, then adding just enough water to bring it together. While they baked in the oven of the Big O'Keefe stove, she fried salt pork and made gravy from the drippings, thickening it with flour and water until it was rich and savory. Caleb found himself mesmerized by the domesticity of the scene, by the sight of a woman working in his kitchen again. It brought back memories, both sweet and painful. Emma humming while she cooked, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of her laughter when he snuck a taste before dinner was ready. "You all right?" Grace asked, and Caleb realized he had been staring. "Yeah, sorry, just haven't had anyone cook for me in a long time." "Well, get used to it. I meant what I said about earning my keep." And they ate at the small kitchen table, the same table Caleb and Emma had ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog back in 1873. $4.50 for solid oak. Emma had been as excited as a child when it arrived. Now Caleb sat in the same spot he always sat, and Emma's place across from him was occupied by this green-eyed girl from Georgia who had somehow walked into his life at exactly the moment he needed someone to save. Or maybe he was the one doing the saving. It was hard to tell. "This is good," Caleb said and meant it. The biscuits were light and fluffy. The gravy was perfectly seasoned. It was a simple meal, but it was the first meal he had truly enjoyed in 3 years. Grace smiled at the compliment. "My mother taught me before she died. She said a woman who could make a good meal from simple ingredients would never go hungry." Smart woman. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Then Grace set down her fork and looked at him directly. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Caleb considered. "Define proper." "Something that isn't beans heated over a fire or jerky eaten in the saddle." "Then it's been a while. Probably 3 weeks ago, last time I went to my brother's place for Sunday dinner." "That's what I thought." Grace's tone held gentle reproach. "You can't live like that, Caleb. Your body needs more than what you've been giving it." There was something about the way she said it, not nagging but genuinely concerned, that made Caleb's chest tighten. When was the last time anyone had cared whether he ate properly or at all? After dinner, Grace insisted on cleaning up while Caleb went out to check on the animals one last time before bed. The evening had cooled considerably, the temperature dropping from the day's brutal high into something almost pleasant. He stood for a moment in the barnyard, looking up at the stars that spread across the sky in a glittering canopy. For the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel like an empty shell. There was light in the kitchen window, the sound of dishes being washed, the knowledge that someone else was there sharing his space. It felt both foreign and achingly familiar, and Caleb wasn't sure how to process the emotions swirling through him. When he came back inside, Grace had finished the dishes and was standing at the kitchen window, drying her hands on a towel. The lamplight caught the gold highlights in her hair. "I wanted to thank you again," she said quietly. "Not just for the room, but for believing me about Mr. Garrett. You don't know how much that means." Caleb moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I know how hard it can be when no one believes you, when you're alone against the world. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." They stood together in comfortable silence for a few moments. Outside the window, the desert night was alive with sounds. Coyotes calling in the distance, the windmill creaking as it turned, the soft shuffle of horses in the barn. "I should let you get some rest," Caleb said finally. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the property properly. If you're still set on working to earn your keep, there's plenty that needs doing." "I'm set," Grace confirmed. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Caleb." Caleb lay awake long after he heard Grace's door close, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom and trying to understand the shift that had occurred in his carefully constructed solitude. He had invited her here out of compassion, he told himself. Nothing more. She needed help, and he had the means to provide it. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, Caleb had to admit that for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel quite so alone. And that feeling, terrifying as it was, also felt like coming back to life. The next morning dawned clear and already warm. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and bacon scents he hadn't experienced in his own kitchen since Emma's death. For a disorienting moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought Emma was still alive. Then reality crashed back and he remembered. Grace, the girl from town, the spare room. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where Grace stood at the stove, her hair neatly pinned, her dress fresh, despite having only two to choose from. She had found the coffee pot in the skillet and was making breakfast with the same quiet efficiency she had shown the night before. "Morning," she said with a small smile. "I hope you don't mind. I woke early and thought I'd make myself useful." "Don't mind at all," Caleb said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Though you don't have to wait on me." "I'm not waiting on you. I'm keeping my word about earning my keep." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Caleb found himself actually enjoying the meal, enjoying the company, enjoying the simple pleasure of not eating alone. He was just reaching for a second biscuit when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch. Caleb tensed, his hand automatically moving toward where his gun belt hung on the peg by the door. Visitors were rare this far from town, and unexpected ones even rarer. Through the window, he saw a rider approaching on a brown gelding. Caleb relaxed slightly when he recognized both horse and rider, his brother Robert. "Looks like we've got company," Caleb said. Grace's face went pale. "Does he know about me being here?" "The whole town knows by now, I'd wager." Caleb stood and grabbed his hat. "Stay here if you want. I'll talk to him." But Grace shook her head and stood as well. "No. If there's going to be trouble about this, I should face it." Caleb felt a flicker of admiration at her courage. They walked out onto the porch together to meet Robert Wright as he dismounted in the yard. Robert was 3 years older than Caleb, slightly heavier around the middle, with the same gray eyes and strong jaw. He nodded politely to Grace, then fixed his brother with a look that Caleb knew well. The look that said they needed to talk, privately and soon. "Robert," Caleb greeted him. "What brings you out here so early?" "Need to talk to you, Caleb." Robert's eyes flicked to Grace, then back. "About Miss Morgan." Grace's shoulders stiffened, but she held her ground. "What about me?" Robert looked uncomfortable. "There's been talk in town. Silas Garrett has been spreading rumors, saying that you're living here in sin, that Caleb's keeping you as his mistress. He's got people riled up, and Sheriff Morrison asked me to ride out and let you know that you might want to come into town and address it." Caleb felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That lying son of a gun." "Caleb," Grace interrupted, her voice calm despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "It's all right. I should have known this would happen. I'll pack my things." "Like hell you will," Caleb said fiercely. "You're not going anywhere. Garrett started this because he couldn't get what he wanted from you, and I'll be damned if I let him run you out of here with his lies." Robert cleared his throat. There might be a way to put the rumors to rest. Both Caleb and Grace turned to look at him. "You could get married," Robert said bluntly. "Make it official. Then no one could say anything about Grace living here." The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Caleb's first instinct was to refuse to say it was ridiculous that people didn't just get married to stop gossip. But as he looked at Grace standing there beside him, her green eyes wide with surprise, and something that might have been hope, he found he couldn't dismiss the idea as easily as he should have. "That's a crazy solution," Grace said, but her voice lacked conviction. Robert shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable with the whole situation, but determined to see it through. "Is it? Think about it, Caleb. If you two were married, Silas would have no grounds for his accusations. Grace would be protected legally and socially. The church ladies would have nothing to whisper about. Sheriff Morrison could tell Silas to go to hell, which I'm pretty sure he'd enjoy doing." Caleb looked at Grace. Her face had gone pale, but she met his eyes with that same defiance he had seen on Main Street yesterday. Less than 24 hours. They had known each other less than a full day, and his brother was suggesting they get married. "Who says it can't be both?" The words were out before Caleb could stop them. Grace's eyes widened. "Both what? Practical and real." Caleb took a step closer to her, aware of Robert watching, but not caring. "I won't pretend to know exactly what I'm feeling, Grace. But I know that having you here, even for just one day, has been better than the past 3 years combined. I know that I looked forward to breakfast this morning more than I've looked forward to anything in a long time, and I dread the thought of you leaving." He saw her breath catch, saw the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. "Caleb, you don't have to say these things just because my brother suggested getting married. I don't expect anything from you beyond what you've already given. I'm not saying them because I have to." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'm saying them because they're true." Robert cleared his throat loudly. "I hate to interrupt this moment, but if you're serious about this, we should probably head into town and talk to Reverend Thomas. The sooner you're married, the sooner this mess gets cleared up, and the sooner Silas Garrett loses his leverage." "What do you say?" Caleb asked Grace, his heart in his throat. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, to his utter shock, she laughed. It was a slightly hysterical sound, half laugh and half sob, but it was genuine. "I say yes, you crazy man. Yes, I'll marry you." The ride into Fort Benson was both the longest and shortest hour of Caleb's life. Grace sat beside him on the wagon seat wearing her best dress, a simple but well-made garment in deep blue that brought out her eyes. Caleb had put on his only suit, brushing off the dust and hoping the mothball smell would dissipate before the ceremony. Robert followed behind on horseback, serving as both witness and guard against any trouble Silas might try to cause. They went straight to the church, a small, white-clapboard building at the edge of town. Reverend Charles Thomas, a kind, elderly man with a shock of white hair and gentle eyes, greeted them with surprise that quickly turned to pleasure when they explained their intention to marry immediately. "I must say this is somewhat unconventional," the Reverend said, looking between Caleb and Grace with fatherly concern. "You're certain about this marriage as a sacred covenant not to be entered into lightly?" "We're certain," Caleb said firmly. Grace nodded her agreement. "As certain as we can be given the circumstances." The Reverend studied them both for another moment, then smiled. "I've learned not to question the workings of the Lord. If you two young people want to be married, I'll be happy to perform the ceremony." "Do you have witnesses?" "I'll stand for them," Robert said, "and my wife Helen, if someone can fetch her from the house." "I'll send my wife to collect her," Reverend Thomas said. "In the meantime, perhaps we should discuss the vows you'll be taking." While they waited for Helen to arrive, the Reverend led them through the traditional marriage vows. Caleb found himself only half listening, his attention fixed on Grace. She stood beside him in the small church office, her hands clasped in front of her, her face composed, but her eyes revealing the turbulence beneath. Were they really doing this? Getting married after knowing each other barely a day, it was madness. Pure madness. And yet when Caleb thought about the alternative, about Grace leaving, about going back to his empty house and his bottle of whiskey and his half-life existence, the madness didn't seem quite so mad. Helen Wright arrived quickly, her round face beaming with happiness despite her obvious confusion about the rushed timing. She was a plump, cheerful woman who had been trying for years to get Caleb remarried. She embraced Grace warmly as if they were already family and whispered something in her ear that made Grace smile. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. They stood in the main sanctuary of the church, afternoon sunlight streaming through the plain glass windows, casting patterns on the worn wooden floor. Reverend Thomas opened his Bible and began reading the familiar words about love and commitment and the joining of two souls. Caleb heard the words as if from a great distance. His entire focus narrowed to the woman standing beside him. Grace had removed her bonnet, and her blonde hair caught the light like spun gold. Her profile was delicate but strong. Her chin lifted her shoulders back. Even now, entering into a marriage of convenience with a man she barely knew, she refused to appear defeated or desperate. "Do you, Caleb Wright, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health to love, and to cherish till death do you part?" Caleb looked into Grace's green eyes and saw his own mixture of nervousness and hope reflected back at him. They were taking a leap of faith, both of them, but somehow it felt right. "I do," he said firmly. "Do you, Grace Morgan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Grace's voice was steady and sure. "I do." Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride. Caleb stepped closer to Grace, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. He had kissed one woman in his life, Emma, and that had been so long ago. But as his lips met Grace's soft and sweet, he felt something kindle in his chest, a warmth that spread through his entire body. The kiss was chaste, appropriate for a church ceremony, but it held the promise of more. When they pulled apart, Grace was blushing, and Caleb knew he was grinning like a fool. Well then, Helen said, breaking the moment with practical efficiency, I suppose this calls for a celebration? You'll all come to dinner at our house. Actually, Caleb said, not taking his eyes off Grace, I was hoping to take my wife home. We have some things to discuss. Robert coughed to hide his laugh. I'm sure you do, brother, but at least stay for a drink to toast your marriage properly. They compromised by stopping at the Lucky Star Saloon for one quick drink. The news of their marriage spread through the building like wildfire. Caleb was gratified to see Silas Garrett's face flush with anger when he heard, though the man was smart enough not to say anything in Caleb's presence. Instead, Silas retreated to a corner table, his expression dark, his fingers drumming on the wood in a way that suggested he was already plotting his next move. Let him plot, Caleb thought. Grace was his wife now, legally and officially, and he would protect what was his. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Grace leaned against Caleb's shoulder. The gesture was tentative at first, as if she wasn't sure it was allowed. When Caleb shifted to put his arm around her, pulling her closer, she relaxed into him with a soft sigh. Did we just really do that? She asked softly. Are we really married? We really did, Mrs. Wright. She smiled at the name. It's going to take some getting used to. We have time, Caleb assured her. All the time in the world. Back at the ranch, Caleb helped Grace down from the wagon. This time he didn't let go immediately. Instead, he pulled her closer until their bodies were almost touching, until he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, until he could count the freckles across her nose. I know this isn't a conventional marriage, he said quietly. And I know we did this partly out of necessity, but I meant what I said earlier, Grace. I want this to be real. I want us to build something together. So do I, Grace replied, her hands resting on his chest. She could probably feel his heart hammering beneath her palms. I've been alone for so long, trying to convince myself I didn't need anyone. But being here with you, it's shown me that there's a difference between being independent and being isolated. I don't want to be isolated anymore. Neither do I. This time when Caleb kissed her, there was no audience, no need to be proper. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. Grace's hands slid up to tangle in his hair. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring out between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Should we go inside? He asked, his voice rough. Grace nodded, suddenly shy. They had been living under the same roof for barely a day, but this was different. She was no longer a guest in his spare room. She was his wife. Inside, Caleb lit lamps while Grace stood in the middle of the living room, looking uncertain for the first time since he had met her. Are you nervous? He asked gently. A little, she admitted. Are you terrified? Caleb said with a small laugh. But in a good way, if that makes sense. It does. She moved closer to him. We don't have to rush anything, do we? This is all new for both of us, this second beginning. We can take our time, let things develop naturally. I'd like that, Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. Though I suppose you should move your things from the spare room to our room. Our room, Grace repeated softly. I like the sound of that. They spent the evening moving Grace's few belongings into Caleb's bedroom, rearranging furniture to make space for her things. It was domestic and ordinary, but somehow intimate in a way that made Caleb's heart race. This was what building a life together looked like. These small acts of accommodation and compromise. That night, they lay together in the bed that had once been Caleb's, alone, fully clothed, and on top of the covers, talking in quiet voices about their hopes and fears, their pasts and possible futures. Caleb told her more about Emma, about the guilt he had carried over not being able to save her or their son. Grace shared the loneliness of growing up without a mother, the weight of responsibility she had carried in caring for her father. Do you think she'd approve? Grace asked at one point. Emma, do you think she'd be happy you found someone? Caleb considered the question seriously. I think she'd want me to be happy. She wasn't the jealous type and she hated seeing people alone. Before she died, she made me promise not to waste my life grieving for her. I broke that promise for 3 years, but maybe now I can start keeping it. I'm glad, Grace whispered. Then more boldly, can I kiss you? Caleb's answer was to pull her close and show her exactly how welcome her kisses were. The weeks that followed their marriage were ones of discovery and adjustment. They learned each other's habits and preferences, their quirks and pet peeves. Caleb discovered that Grace sang when she was happy and got very quiet when she was upset. Grace learned that Caleb was gentler than his rough exterior, suggested that he had a dry sense of humor that came out when he was relaxed, that he checked on the horses every night before bed, no matter how tired he was. They also learned each other physically, the marriage becoming a true union in every sense. Caleb was patient and tender, understanding that this was all new for Grace. She responded to his gentleness with a passion that surprised them both, and the spare room remained empty, while they shared the larger bedroom, their lives intertwining more completely with each passing day. One morning in early September, a visitor arrived who would change the course of their lives. Mr. Harrison from the Bank of Fort Benson rode up to the ranch in a buggy, his face serious beneath his bowler hat. Caleb tensed when he saw who it was. The bank. Silas Garrett owned 25% of the bank. Had Silas convinced them to call in Caleb's loan, he still owed $800 with payments due quarterly at 8% interest. Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright, Harrison greeted them formally. Congratulations on your recent marriage. I apologize for the intrusion, but I have some business to discuss. What kind of business? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Harrison pulled a leather portfolio from his buggy. The McCready Ranch adjacent to yours is being sold. The widow is moving back east to live with her daughter. 200 acres of good grazing land with access to Crystal Creek. The bank is handling the sale, and I wanted to offer you first opportunity to purchase before we list it publicly. Caleb felt his stomach clench. 200 acres. That would more than double his land. Access to Crystal Creek would solve his water problems permanently. But the price, how much, he asked? $1,500. We'd require $300 down and would finance the rest at 7% interest over 5 years. $1,500. It might as well have been $15,000. Caleb had barely $50 in cash after paying his quarterly loan payment last month. There was no way he could come up with $300. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrison, but I'm afraid I can't afford that kind of expansion right now. Could we see the financial terms? Grace spoke up suddenly. Both men turned to look at her. She stepped forward, her expression calm and businesslike. The specific terms of the financing, I mean. The payment schedule, the total cost over the life of the loan, the conditions for early payoff. Harrison looked surprised but pulled out a sheet of paper covered in numbers. Grace took it and studied it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she did calculations in her head. With current cattle prices at $28 per head, she said, and assuming normal rainfall patterns resume after this dry spell, we could pay this back in 3 years instead of 5 if we're careful. The interest savings alone would be substantial. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Wright, you have quite a head for numbers. My father taught me. Grace looked at Caleb. Can we discuss this privately? Caleb excused them and led Grace into the house, his mind reeling. She was actually considering this, taking on more debt when they were already stretched thin. Grace, it's too risky. If we fail, we lose everything, the new land and this ranch both. We won't fail. Her voice was confident. I've been going through your books, Caleb. You're being too conservative. You could support twice as many cattle on the land you have now if you manage the grazing better. Add 200 acres and access to year-round water, and we could build something significant. And you've been going through my books. You said I could earn my keep. I'm good with numbers. Let me help. Caleb looked at his wife, this woman he had known for less than a month, and saw the certainty in her eyes. The same certainty that had kept her head high when she was thrown out on the street. The same strength that had led her to accept his proposal despite all the risks. If we do this, he said slowly, we're partners, full partners. I want your input on every major decision. Grace's smile lit up her whole face. I wouldn't have it any other way. They went back outside together. Mr. Harrison, Caleb said, we'll take it, but we'll need some time to raise the down payment. How much time? Caleb looked at Grace. She bit her lip, thinking, 60 days. Harrison nodded. That's acceptable. I'll draw up the papers. But I have to warn you, Mr. Wright, Silas Garrett has also expressed interest in this property. If you can't come up with the money, he'll be next in line. Of course he would be. Silas would love nothing more than to own the land surrounding Caleb's ranch, boxing him in, controlling his access to water. We'll have the money, Grace said firmly. After Harrison left, Caleb and Grace stood in the yard looking out at the land that might soon be theirs. How are we going to raise $300 in 60 days? Caleb asked. I don't know yet, Grace admitted, but we'll find a way. September bled into October with no rain. The drought that had started as a minor concern became a serious problem. The stream that ran through Caleb's property slowed to a trickle, then stopped flowing altogether. The cattle had to be driven 2 miles to the nearest reliable water source twice a day, an exhausting and time-consuming process. Caleb hired 2 ranch hands brothers named Tom and Jim Fletcher, who had recently arrived from Texas looking for work. With their help, he managed to keep the operation running, but the strain was showing. The cattle were losing weight, grass was dying, and the money situation was getting desperate. In early November, Grace sat at the kitchen table with Caleb's ledger spread before her, doing calculations by lamplight. Her face was grave when Caleb came in from the evening chores. How bad is it? He asked. Bad. We got enough to make it through January, maybe February if we're very careful. But the down payment for the McCready land is due in 3 weeks. We have $70 saved. We need $230 more. Caleb sat down heavily in his chair. We could sell some cattle. Prices are terrible right now because of the drought. We'd get maybe $15 a head instead of 28. We'd have to sell 15 head to raise the money, and that would leave us with barely enough breeding stock to recover when the rains come. Then what do we do? Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, we could sell my mother's jewelry. It's not worth a fortune, but the cameo brooch is real gold, and the stones are genuine. Might fetch $50 or $60. No, Caleb's voice was firm. That's all you have left of your mother. I won't ask you to give that up. You're not asking. I'm offering. Grace reached across the table to take his hand. We're partners. Remember, what's mine is yours. In the end, they sold the brooch to a jeweler in Tucson for $55. Caleb swallowed his pride and asked Robert for a short-term loan of $100. His brother agreed without hesitation, refusing to charge interest and insisting they pay it back when they could not before. Between savings, the brooch Robert's loan, and selling 3 head of cattle at depressed prices, they scraped together $300 by the deadline. Mr. Harrison drew up the papers, and just like that, Caleb and Grace Wright owned 520 acres of Arizona territory. But the celebration was muted. The drought continued. The debt had more than doubled. And Grace had been feeling unwell for the past 2 weeks, unable to keep down breakfast, exhausted by midday. It was Helen who finally said what Grace herself had been afraid to voice. They were in town getting supplies when Helen pulled Grace aside, her face concerned. How long have you been feeling poorly, dear? About 3 weeks now. It's nothing, just a stomach ailment. Helen's expression turned knowing. Grace, honey, have you considered that you might be expecting? The words hit Grace like a bucket of cold water. Expecting. Pregnant. She had been so focused on the ranch, on the money problems, on simply surviving day to day, that she hadn't even considered. But now that Helen said it, the pieces fell into place. The nausea, the exhaustion, the changes in her body she had been too preoccupied to notice. I think I need to see Doc Anderson, Grace said faintly. Dr. Henry Anderson confirmed what Helen had suspected. Grace was approximately 6 weeks pregnant, which meant the baby would arrive sometime in late May or early June. Grace sat on the examination table in Doc Anderson's office, her mind racing. A baby. She was going to have a baby. Caleb's baby. Under any other circumstances, the news would have filled her with pure joy. But now, with the drought and the debt and the memory of how Emma had died in childbirth, Mrs. Wright, Doc Anderson's kind voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Are you all right? How did she die? Grace asked abruptly. Emma Wright, how exactly did she die? Doc Anderson's face grew grave. Placental abruption. The placenta separated from the uterine wall before the baby was born. She bled to death before I could do anything to help. The baby had already passed. Could it happen to me? It could happen to anyone, the doctor said honestly. But it's rare, Grace. I've delivered dozens of babies, and Emma's was the only case I've seen. You're young and healthy. There's no reason to think you won't have a perfectly normal delivery. Grace wanted to believe him, but she had seen the haunted look in Caleb's eyes when he spoke of Emma. She knew the terror he had lived through, and now she was going to put him through it again. She waited until after dinner to tell him. They were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains when Grace finally gathered her courage. Caleb, I need to tell you something. He turned to look at her, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think anything's wrong. I went to see Doc Anderson today. Caleb's face went white. Are you sick? Is it serious? No, I'm not sick. Grace took his hand, holding it tight. Caleb, I'm pregnant. For a moment, he didn't react at all. He just stared at her, his face frozen in shock. Then she saw the emotions cascade across his features. Shock giving way to fear, fear struggling against joy, joy warring with terror. Grace, he whispered. His voice broke on her name. I know you're scared, she said quickly. I'm scared too. But Doc Anderson says I'm healthy, that there's no reason to think anything will go wrong. Caleb pulled his hand free and stood abruptly, walking to the edge of the porch. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I can't lose you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace, I can't go through that again. I can't. She went to him, wrapping her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. You won't lose me. I'm young and strong, and we caught it early. I'm going to be fine. We're going to be fine. What if you're not? He turned in her arms, his gray eyes wet with unshed tears. What if something goes wrong? What if I have to choose between you and the baby? What if... Grace put her fingers over his lips, stopping the flood of terrible possibilities. Don't borrow trouble, Caleb. We have 6 months. 6 months to prepare, to make sure everything's ready. Doc Anderson will be here. Your family will help. And I'm not Emma. Every pregnancy is different. Caleb pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. She felt his body shaking and realized he was crying. Great silent sobs that spoke of fear and grief and desperate hope, all tangled together. They stood that way for a longer time, holding each other as the sun disappeared and the stars came out one by one. Finally, Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. A baby, he said, and this time there was wonder in his voice along with the fear. We're going to have a baby. We are. When the Doc Anderson thinks late May or early June, Caleb did the math in his head. That means we conceived right after the wedding. Grace felt herself blush. Seems that way. Despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty, Caleb smiled. A real smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Well then, I guess we'd better make sure we have a ranch worth inheriting when this child grows up. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was one of the hardest of Caleb's life. The drought continued without relief. By January, even the deep wells were running low. Caleb and the Fletcher brothers spent brutal 14-hour days hauling water, moving cattle, and trying to keep the ranch from falling apart. Grace worked just as hard despite Caleb's protests. She managed the books, planned the meals to stretch their dwindling supplies, tended what remained of the vegetable garden, and somehow kept the household running. As her pregnancy advanced, Caleb became increasingly protective, forbidding her from lifting anything heavy or spending too much time in the sun. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she protested one day when he physically lifted her over a mud puddle rather than let her walk through it. Humor me, Caleb replied, his jaw set in that stubborn way she had come to recognize. I've already lost one wife and child. I won't take any chances with you. How could she argue with that? In March, the loan payment came due. $120 including interest. They paid it, but it left them with less than $40 in cash reserves. If the drought continued much longer, they would have to start selling cattle at disastrously low prices just to survive. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Caleb, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. They had taken on too much debt, expanded too fast. What if they lost everything? What if their child was born into poverty and failure? She must have made some sound because Caleb stirred beside her. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice rough with sleep. Just thinking. He pulled her closer, his hand resting gently on the swell of her belly, where their child grew. At 5 months pregnant, Grace was unmistakably showing now. What are you thinking about? Whether we've doomed ourselves, whether we should have played it safe instead of reaching for more. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father once told me that the only people who never fail are the people who never try. We're trying, Grace. That's all anyone can do. What if trying isn't enough? Then we fail, we learn, and we try again. Together." The word together settled something anxious in Grace's chest. She was not alone in this. They would face whatever came as partners. In April, the rains finally came. Not the gentle spring rains Arizona usually received, but massive thunderstorms that rolled across the desert with terrifying power. The dry ground couldn't absorb the water fast enough. Flash floods threatened the cattle. Caleb, Tom, and Jim worked through the night in driving rain to move the herd to higher ground, while lightning split the sky and thunder shook the earth. Grace, 6 months pregnant and forbidden by Caleb from leaving the house, kept the fire going and hot coffee ready. When the men finally staggered in near dawn, soaked through and exhausted but victorious, she had dry clothes and hot food waiting. They had saved 90% of the herd. The losses were manageable. And as the rains continued over the next weeks, the parched land transformed almost overnight. Green grass sprouted, the streams filled, the cattle began to fatten. The crisis finally was over. By May, with Grace's belly huge and the baby's arrival imminent, things had stabilized. The cattle were thriving. The grass was lush. They would be able to make their next loan payment with money left over. Against all odds, they were going to make it. Doc Anderson visited the ranch regularly now, checking on Grace's progress. "Everything looks perfect," he assured them. "Baby's positioned correctly, heartbeat is strong. Should be a straightforward delivery." But Caleb remained anxious. As Grace's due date approached, he became almost obsessive about her care. He wouldn't let her lift a finger around the house. Helen came to stay with them both to help and to keep Grace company as Caleb drove himself and the ranch hands to prepare for the birth and the weeks after when Grace would need to recover. On a warm evening in early June, Grace felt the first contraction. It was mild, just a tightening across her belly that made her pause in her knitting. She said nothing, not wanting to alarm Caleb unnecessarily. First babies took a long time. There was no need to panic yet. But over the next few hours, the contractions grew stronger and more regular. By midnight, Grace could no longer hide them. Caleb saw her face go white with pain during a particularly strong one and was instantly on his feet. "It's time. Tom, ride to town and get Doc Anderson. Now." Tom Fletcher threw a saddle on the fastest horse and rode into the darkness. Helen helped Grace into the bedroom, talking to her in a calm, soothing voice about breathing and relaxation. Caleb paced the living room like a caged animal, his face pale, his hands shaking. An hour passed. 2 hours. Tom should have been back by now with Doc Anderson. The contractions were coming faster. Grace's pains were intensifying, and still no doctor. Helen came out of the bedroom, her face grave. "Caleb, the baby's coming faster than expected. I don't think we can wait for Doc Anderson." Caleb felt ice flood his veins. "What do you mean?" "I mean you might have to deliver this baby yourself." Everything in Caleb wanted to refuse. He couldn't do this. He didn't know how. The last time he had been in a room with a woman giving birth, that woman had died. Emma had died. Their son had died. All the blood, all the screaming, and all the helplessness as he watched his wife slip away and couldn't do anything to stop it. "Caleb," Helen's voice was firm, "I need you to focus. Grace needs you. Can you do this?" He thought of Grace in that bedroom and pain-scared, needing him. His wife, the mother of his child, the woman who had brought him back to life when he thought he would spend the rest of his days as a ghost. "Tell me what to do," he said. The next hours were the longest of Caleb's life. Following Helen's instructions, he helped Grace through contraction after contraction. She screamed, she cried, she gripped his hands so hard he thought his bones would break. But she didn't give up. Through it all, Grace kept fighting. "I can't do this," she sobbed at one point. "Caleb, I can't." "Yes, you can." He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." "I'm so scared." "So am I, but we're doing it together, remember?" As dawn light began to filter through the bedroom window, Doc Anderson finally burst through the door, Tom Fletcher close behind him. The doctor took one look at the situation and moved immediately into action. "You've done well," he told Caleb, "but I'll take it from here. Grace, with the next contraction, I need you to push. Can you do that for me?" Grace, exhausted and soaked with sweat, nodded. When the next contraction came, she pushed with everything she had left. Caleb held her hand, murmured encouragement, and prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. "I see the head," Doc Anderson said. "One more big push, Grace. Just one more." Grace gathered every ounce of strength she had and pushed. The baby slid free in a rush, and Doc Anderson caught the tiny, slippery infant with practiced hands. For one terrible moment, there was silence. Then the baby drew breath and let out a sharp, angry cry. "It's a boy," Doc Anderson announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A healthy baby boy." Caleb felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. The baby was perfect, tiny and red, wolfed and covered in vernix, but perfect. And Grace, his Grace, was alive, exhausted but alive and smiling at him through her own tears. Doc Anderson worked quickly, cutting the cord and cleaning the baby. Then he placed the infant in Grace's arms, and Caleb watched his wife cradle their son with a look of pure wonder on her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Caleb sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Grace, one hand touching the soft, dark hair on his son's head. He had thought he would never have this again. A family, a future, hope. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now, looking at this tiny miracle in Grace's arms, Caleb knew exactly what the name should be. "Samuel," he said, "after my grandfather, a good man who worked hard and never gave up. Samuel Wright." "Samuel," Grace repeated, testing the name. "Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the family." Doc Anderson finished his work and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. "You did well, Mrs. Wright. Much easier than most first births I've attended. You should recover quickly with proper rest." After the doctor and Helen left, giving them privacy, Caleb lay beside Grace and baby Samuel in the bed, where 3 years ago Emma had died. But this time there was life instead of death, hope instead of grief, a future instead of an ending. "I love you," Caleb said quietly. "I know I say it often, but I don't think you can hear it enough. You've given me something I never thought I'd have again. A family, a reason to wake up excited about the day ahead." "You've given me the same," Grace replied, too exhausted to keep her eyes open, but too happy to sleep. "A home, security, love, everything I was looking for when I came west." "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "The way we got together, the rushed wedding, all of it." Grace thought about it. About that day Mrs. Pemberton had thrown her out of the boarding house. About the moment Caleb had offered her his spare room and ultimately his heart. About how they had built this life together from nothing but hope and hard work. "No," she said firmly, "not for a second. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places." Caleb kissed her forehead. "Get some rest. I'll watch over you both." As Grace drifted off to sleep with Samuel in her arms, Caleb sat guard over his family and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. One gunshot on a hot August afternoon. One act of compassion toward a stranger. One leap of faith into marriage with a woman he barely knew. And it had given him everything. Through the window he saw Tom Fletcher riding toward the house at a gallop, his face urgent. Caleb carefully extracted himself from the bed and went to meet him at the door. "Boss," Tom said breathlessly, "I just heard in town, Silas Garrett bought the land on our eastern border. That 300 acres between us and Crystal Creek. He's planning to fence it off, cut off your water access." Caleb felt cold settle in his gut. Of course, Silas Garrett couldn't stand to see them succeed, so he had found another way to attack, another way to try and destroy them. But Caleb looked back through the door at Grace and Samuel sleeping peacefully in the morning light, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had survived poverty, drought, and childbirth. They would survive Silas Garrett too. January brought cold winds and clear skies to Fort Benson. Samuel Wright was 6 months old, healthy and thriving, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's golden hair. The ranch had recovered from the drought. The cattle were fat on winter grass. The loan payments were being made on time. For the first time since their hurried wedding 18 months ago, Caleb and Grace could breathe without the constant weight of financial disaster pressing down on them. Then Silas Garrett came to call. It was a Sunday morning. Caleb was in the barn mucking out stalls while Grace fed Samuel in the house. He heard horses approaching and looked out to see Silas riding up the path, Sheriff Tom Morrison beside him. Caleb's hands tightened on the pitchfork he was holding. Nothing good ever came from Silas Garrett paying a visit. Caleb walked out to meet them, wiping his hands on his pants. Silas, Sheriff, what brings you out here on the Lord's Day? Silas dismounted with practiced ease. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit with a brocade vest, his boots polished to a high shine. Everything about him screamed wealth and respectability. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable, his eyes not quite meeting Caleb's. Just here to inform my neighbor of new property lines, Silas said with that smile Caleb had come to loathe. I've recently acquired the Parker Tract, 300 acres directly east of your property. Caleb had heard about the sale. Old man Parker had died 2 months back, and his children had been eager to unload the land and split the money. But he hadn't known who the buyer was. Congratulations on your purchase, Caleb said evenly. Thank you. Silas pulled a folded map from his coat pocket. I wanted to make sure you were aware of the exact boundaries. As you can see, the eastern fence line runs right here along this ridge. Caleb studied the map and his blood ran cold. The fence line Silas was proposing would cut off Caleb's access to Crystal Creek, the reliable water source that had saved his cattle during the drought. That water has been shared between properties for 20 years, Caleb said, keeping his voice level with effort. Shared under the old ownership, perhaps. But I'm the new owner, and I have every right to fence my property as I see fit. Silas's smile widened. Unless, of course, you'd like to make me an offer for your ranch. I'd be willing to pay fair market value. Might be easier than trying to run a cattle operation with a limited water access. So that was his game. Buy the surrounding land, choke off the water force Caleb to sell at whatever price Silas dictated. It was ruthless and perfectly legal. My ranch isn't for sale, Caleb said. Pity. Silas folded the map and tucked it back in his pocket. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. I'll have my men start on the fence next week. Good day, Mr. Wright. After they rode away, Caleb stood in the yard, fury and fear warring inside him. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed could be destroyed by a fence line. Without reliable water, he would have to sell half his cattle. Without half his cattle, he couldn't make the loan payments. Without making the payments, he would lose the ranch. Grace came out of the house with Samuel on her hip. One look at Caleb's face told her something was badly wrong. What happened? Caleb explained about Silas's purchase, about the fence, about the water. Grace's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. There has to be a way to fight this. Legal precedent, water rights, something. I don't know enough about the law to know if there is. Then we find someone who does. Grace shifted Samuel to her other hip. We hire a lawyer. They couldn't afford a lawyer. But they also couldn't afford not to have one. The next day, Grace rode into town and sent a telegram to Tucson. A week later, a lawyer named Martin Blackwood arrived at the ranch. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet competence. Mrs. Wright's telegram intrigued me, he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Water rights cases are complex, but if what you've told me is accurate, you may have grounds for an easement claim. What's an easement? Caleb asked. A legal right to use someone else's property for a specific purpose. If there's a history of shared water access, if it's necessary for your ranch to function, and if it was understood when you purchased the property that you would have access, then you may be able to force Silas Garrett to maintain that access. Hope flickered in Caleb's chest. How do we prove that? We need documentation. Old land surveys, deeds, testimony from people who knew about the water sharing arrangement. Can you get those? I can try. Over the next month, Caleb and Grace worked tirelessly to build their case. Caleb rode to the county courthouse and dug through old records, finding surveys from 1865 that showed a notation about shared water access. Grace interviewed old-timers in Fort Benson, taking careful notes about their memories of how the land had been used. Robert Wright provided a sworn affidavit testifying that his father and Old Man Parker had always shared Crystal Creek, that it was common knowledge among the ranchers in the area. Even Helen contributed researching property law in the Territorial Library and finding precedents from similar cases. Silas, meanwhile, was not idle. He hired his own lawyers, expensive men from Phoenix, who arrived with leather cases full of documents and arguments. He held dinner parties for Judge Edmund Crawford, who would be hearing the case. He made donations to the church and the school. He reminded everyone who would listen that he was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community, while Caleb Wright was just a small rancher who had married a woman accused of theft. The trial was set for the first week of May to be held in the Fort Benson courthouse. It was the biggest legal proceeding the town had seen in years. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers when Caleb and Grace arrived on the appointed morning. Judge Crawford was a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, but also for strict adherence to the letter of the law. He called the court to order and listened as both sides made their opening arguments. Silas's lawyer was smooth and polished. He argued that property rights were absolute, that a man had the right to do as he pleased with land he owned, that shared access was a courtesy that could be revoked at any time. Martin Blackwood was less flashy but more substantive. He presented the old surveys, the affidavits, the history of water sharing. He argued that Caleb had purchased his ranch with the reasonable expectation of water access, that to cut it off now would be to destroy the value of his property. The testimony stretched over 3 days. Old-timers took the stand and talked about how things had always been done. County officials testified about land records and survey markers. Robert Wright spoke eloquently about his father's friendship with Parker and their gentleman's agreement about the water. Then Silas himself took the stand. He was confident, almost cocky, as he settled into the witness chair. He testified that he had purchased the Parker tract in good faith, that he had every right to fence it, that he had made Caleb a fair offer to buy his ranch and been refused. "I'm a businessman," Silas said, looking directly at Judge Crawford. "I make decisions based on what's best for my investments. If Mr. Wright finds himself in a difficult position, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to subsidize his operation." Blackwood rose for cross-examination. He was quiet at first, asking gentle questions about Silas's business practices, about his other properties, about his standing in the community. Then he said, "Mr. Garrett, could you tell the court what time it is?" Silas looked surprised. "I'm sorry. The time. Do you have a watch?" "I do." Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a gold pocket watch, the chain glinting in the courtroom light. "That's a beautiful piece," Blackwood said. "How long have you owned it?" "Several years." "Why is this relevant?" "Because that's the watch you accused Mrs. Wright of stealing in August of 1878, is it not?" The courtroom erupted. People gasped and whispered. Silas's face went red, then white. His lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. Judge Crawford banged his gavel for order. "Mr. Blackwood, what is the meaning of this?" "Your Honor, it goes to the character of the witness. Mr. Garrett accused Mrs. Wright of theft, had her evicted from her boarding house, and spread rumors that nearly destroyed her reputation. But here is the watch in his possession, proving he lied." "That's not true." Silas stood up, his composure finally cracking. I found it later, after she left." "Then why didn't you file a report with Sheriff Morrison saying the watch had been recovered? Why didn't you apologize to Mrs. Wright for the false accusation? Why did you continue to tell people she was a thief?" Silas had no answer. He sat there, red-faced and trembling, while the courtroom buzzed with scandalized whispers. Blackwood pressed his advantage. "Mr. Garrett, isn't it true that you have a pattern of making false accusations against women who reject your advances? That you did the same thing to a waitress named Alice Harrison in 1875 and to a widow named Judith Carr in 1877. "Objection." Silas's lawyer was on his feet. "This is character assassination, not relevant to the water rights case." "It's relevant to the witness's credibility, Your Honor," Blackwood replied calmly. "If Mr. Garrett is willing to lie and destroy reputations when it suits him, why should we believe his testimony about his intentions regarding the fence?" Judge Crawford considered. "I'll allow it. Mr. Garrett, please answer the question." But Silas couldn't answer. He sat there, mouth opening and closing, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling before the eyes of everyone who had believed in him. Sheriff Morrison, sitting in the gallery, stood up. His face was grave. "Your Honor, if I may, I never took an official theft report from Mr. Garrett about that watch. He told me informally that it was missing, but when offered to investigate, he said it wasn't necessary. Now I'm wondering why. The trial continued for another day, but the damage was done. Silas's credibility was destroyed. His lawyer tried to salvage the case by focusing purely on property law, but Judge Crawford's demeanor had changed. He was no longer listening to Silas's arguments with friendly interest, but with skeptical examination. When the verdict came down, it was decisive. Judge Crawford ruled that an easement did exist, that Caleb had the legal right to access Crystal Creek across Silas's property, and that Silas was ordered to pay all court costs. The law protects property rights, the judge said in his ruling, but it also recognizes that certain uses of property can become rights in themselves through long custom and necessity. Mr. Wright purchased his ranch with the reasonable expectation of water access. To deny him that access now would be unjust enrichment for Mr. Garrett and ruinous harm to Mr. Wright. The easement is hereby recognized and recorded. Caleb and Grace walked out of the courthouse into bright May sunshine, hardly daring to believe they had won. Behind them, they could hear people talking, a tide of public opinion turning sharply against Silas Garrett. Did you see his face when they brought out that watch? I always wondered about those accusations. Poor Grace Wright, what she must have gone through. Silas himself stood on the courthouse steps, his lawyers packing their cases, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked at Caleb and Grace, and for a moment pure hatred blazed in his eyes. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You haven't seen the last of me. Then he turned and walked away, his back stiff with wounded pride. The victory should have brought peace, and for a time it did. Summer came hot and dry, but not drought level. The cattle thrived. Samuel grew into a cheerful toddler who delighted in chasing the chickens and getting underfoot during chores. Grace discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the news brought only joy. They had survived so much. Surely the worst was behind them. The years flowed by like water in Crystal Creek. In 1881, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Emma after Caleb's first wife. It felt right to both of them, a way of honoring the past while embracing the future. Emma had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and from the moment she drew breath, she wrapped the entire household around her tiny finger. By 1885, they had added a son named Henry to the family. The ranch prospered. They paid off the McCready land ahead of schedule, then used the freed-up income to buy more cattle, hire more hands, expand the operation. What had started as a desperate gamble became a thriving business. Caleb watched his children grow with wonder that never faded. Samuel, at 6 years old, already showed an aptitude for ranching, following his father everywhere, asking endless questions about cattle and horse and the land. Emma, at 4, was fierce and independent, refusing to wear dresses when she could get away with it, preferring to climb trees and race her brother. Henry was still a baby, but he had his mother's quick mind and his father's steady temperament. Grace had become a respected member of the Fort Benson community. The whispers about her past had faded, replaced by admiration for her business acumen and her charity work. She had started a small lending library for the town, donated generously to the school, and served on the church committee. The girl who had been thrown out of a boarding house with nothing was now Mrs. Caleb Wright, one of the most respected women in the county. Silas Garrett, meanwhile, had faded from prominence. The revelations at the trial had cost him dearly. People who had once courted his favor now kept their distance. His business suffered. There were whispers that he had started drinking heavily, that his daughter Abigail was being raised mostly by servants, while Silas spent his days in the saloon. Caleb should have felt satisfaction at Silas's downfall. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to pity. He remembered his own dark years after Emma's death, the way grief and rage could poison a man from the inside out. Silas Garrett was drowning in his own bitterness, and no one was throwing him a rope. In 1888, Grace gave birth to twins, 2 girls they named Rose and Lily. The ranch house, which had once felt too big and empty for one lonely widower, now rang with the sounds of 5 children. It was chaos and joy in equal measure. And then came the summer of 1891. July in Arizona was brutal. The temperature climbed over 100 degrees for days on end. The grass turned brown and brittle. Every spark was a potential disaster, and Caleb warned his hands repeatedly about being careful with cigarettes and campfires. It was lightning that did it. A massive thunderstorm rolled across the desert one evening, all fury and no rain. Lightning struck the barn, and within minutes the old wooden structure was engulfed in flames. Caleb was in the house when he heard the shouts. He ran outside and saw the barn blazing like a torch against the darkening sky. His first thought was the horses. 6 horses in there, including Buck and Dancer, who were 18 and 20 years old and had been with him since before Emma died. "Get water," he shouted to Tom Fletcher. "Form a bucket line. Don't let it spread to the house." Then he ran toward the barn. "Caleb, no," Grace screamed from the porch. She was holding Henry and Lily with Emma and Rose clinging to her skirts. Samuel, 12 years old and thinking himself a man, started to run after his father. "Stay with your mother," Caleb ordered, and the tone in his voice stopped Samuel in his tracks. Inside the barn, the heat was overwhelming. Smoke filled Caleb's lungs, making him cough and gasp. The horses were screaming, terrified by the fire and smoke. He could barely see through the haze, but he knew this barn by heart. He found the first stall and threw it open, slapping the horse's rump to drive it outside. Then the second, the third. He was reaching for the fourth stall when he heard a terrible creaking sound above him. He looked up and saw a massive beam eaten through by fire beginning to fall. Caleb tried to move, but his boot caught on something. The beam came down, pinning him to the ground. Pain exploded through his leg and back. He tried to push the beam off, but it was too heavy, and his strength was fading in the heat and smoke. "This is how I die," he thought with strange calm. Not shot by outlaws or thrown from a horse, but burned alive, trying to save animals. Through the roar of the flames, he heard a voice shouting his name. "Papa, where are you?" Samuel, his son, had come into the burning barn after him. "Get out!" Caleb tried to yell, but it came out as a cough. "Samuel, get out of here!" Then the boy was there, his face streaked with soot and tears, his hands grabbing the beam. "I can't lift it." "Then go get help. Leave me." "I'm not leaving you." Tom Fletcher appeared out of the smoke, took one look at the situation, and added his strength to Samuel's. Together they heaved the beam up just enough for Caleb to drag himself free. Tom threw Caleb's arm over his shoulder and hauled him toward the exit while Samuel ran ahead coughing and gasping. They made it out just as another section of roof collapsed. Caleb lay on the ground, sucking in clean air, his legs screaming with pain, watching his barn burn to the ground. Grace was there, her hands on his face, his chest checking for injuries. "Don't you ever do that again. Do you hear me? Don't you ever scare me like that again." Behind her, Samuel stood with his shoulders heaving, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "I couldn't let him," the boy said. "I couldn't." Caleb reached out and grabbed his son's hand. "You saved my life." "You would have done the same for me." Doc Anderson was summoned. He declared that Caleb had a broken leg, burns on his arms and back, and smoke damage to his lungs, but that he would recover. "You're a lucky man, Caleb, right? A few more minutes in there, and you would have died." "I know." The barn was a total loss. The structure collapsed completely, leaving only charred timbers and ash. But they had saved all 6 horses. That was something. Caleb spent the next 2 weeks in bed, his legs splinted, and elevated his burns wrapped in bandages, soaked with Doc Anderson's salve. Grace tended to him with fierce devotion, changing bandages, spooning soup into his mouth, reading to him when he couldn't sleep. On the 15th day, Tom Fletcher came into the bedroom with news that made Caleb try to sit up too fast and pull at his healing wounds. "Silas Garrett is here to see you." "Tell him to go to hell," Grace said immediately. "He says he wants to help," Tom said. "He's got $500 with him. Says it's for rebuilding the barn." Caleb and Grace exchanged a look of pure shock. "Let him in," Caleb said finally. Silas Garrett looked terrible. He had aged 10 years in the decade since the trial. His face was gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands shaking slightly. He stood in the doorway of Caleb's bedroom, hat in hand, and looked at the floor. "I heard about the fire," he said. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it much lately. "Heard you almost died saving your horses." "What do you want, Silas?" Caleb asked. He kept his voice neutral, not hostile, but not welcoming either. "To help, to do one decent thing." Silas pulled a thick envelope from his coat. "This is $500. It's all I have left after everything. I want you to use it to rebuild your barn." "Why?" Grace asked. "After everything you've done to us, why would you help now?" Silas finally looked up and Caleb saw genuine anguish in the man's eyes. Because I've spent 13 years being bitter and hateful, and it's cost me everything. My business is failing. My daughter barely knows me. The whole town looks at me with contempt, and I earned every bit of it. He took a shuddering breath. I watched you build this beautiful life, and I hated you for it. But you didn't deserve to die in that fire. No one does. He set the envelope on the dresser. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just want to do something right before I lose what little I have left. Caleb looked at the envelope, then at Silas, then at Grace. She gave him a tiny nod. I can't take your money, Silas. Please, there were tears on Silas's face now. Please let me do this. I'll make you a deal, Caleb said slowly. Keep your money, but come work for us. Help rebuild the barn with your own hands. Show your daughter what it means to make amends. Silas stared at him. You would trust me on your ranch after everything. My wife taught me about second chances, Caleb said, reaching for Grace's hand. Seems only right to pass that along. Silas Garrett worked on the Wright Ranch for the next 4 years. He was there every day at dawn, hammer in hand, working alongside Tom and Jim Fletcher and the other hands. He didn't talk much at first. He just worked, pouring his energy into building the finest barn Fort Benson had ever seen. Slowly, grudgingly, the other men accepted him. They saw that he pulled his weight, that he didn't complain, that he was genuinely trying to make amends. The children, especially Samuel, were more forgiving. They saw only a broken man who was trying to be better. Silas's daughter Abigail, 13 years old when her father started working at the Wright Ranch, began to visit on Sundays. Grace took her under her wing, inviting her to stay for dinner, teaching her to bake bread and can vegetables. The girl bloomed under the attention, and Silas wept the first time he heard his daughter laugh. In 1895, on a cold January morning, Silas Garrett died in his sleep. Heart failure, Doc Anderson said. Peaceful. He was 58 years old, but he looked 80. They found him in the small room above the barn that had become his home. Beside his bed was a letter addressed to Caleb and Grace. I don't have much to leave behind, the letter read in Silas's shaky handwriting. But I want you to know that these last years working for you, being allowed to be part of something good, they were the happiest of my life. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change. Thank you for the grace you gave a bitter old fool. Take care of Abigail for me. She deserves better than I gave her. They buried Silas in the Wright family plot next to Emma and the unnamed baby. At the funeral, Caleb spoke about redemption and second chances. He spoke about how hatred poisoned the soul and how forgiveness healed both the giver and the receiver. Half the town attended, and many who had once despised Silas wept for the man he had become in his final years. Abigail Garrett became part of the Wright household, a sister to the 5 Wright children. Years later, she would marry a lawyer from Tucson and name her first son Silas after the father who had found redemption at the end. The turn of the century found the Wright family thriving. Samuel, now 21, had taken over most of the day-to-day ranch management. He was engaged to Ruth Brennan, a sweet girl from town with a practical streak that reminded Caleb of Grace. The wedding was planned for June. Emma, at 19, taught school in Fort Benson. She had her mother's love of learning and her father's patience. She was being courted by Doc Anderson's nephew, a young physician who had set up practice in town. Henry, 15, had discovered a passion for veterinary medicine. He spent all his free time with the animals, reading every book he could find about animal husbandry and health. He had plans to attend veterinary school in California. The twins Rose and Lily were 13 and identical except for their interests. Rose had developed a passion for photography, saving every penny to buy a camera and experimenting with different techniques. Lily wanted to be a journalist, filling notebook after notebook with observations about ranch life and the changing West. Grace, at 44, was still beautiful. A few lines around her eyes, a few silver threads in her blonde hair, but to Caleb, she looked exactly as she had that day on Main Street when he had first offered her help. Strong, determined, unbreakable. Caleb himself was 69 now. His legs still ached where the beam had broken it. His back protested long days in the saddle. But he had lived to see his children grow, to see his ranch prosper, to build a legacy that would outlast him. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole town turned out for a celebration at the ranch. There were speeches and toasts and a fiddle band that played until dawn. Caleb and Grace danced together under the stars, moving slowly to music that reminded them both of simpler times. 25 years, Grace set her head on his shoulder. Did you ever imagine we'd make it this far? I didn't imagine much of anything that day I saw you get thrown out of the boarding house, Caleb admitted. I was just trying to do the right thing. And look what it got you. 5 children, 12 grandchildren on the way, and a wife who still loves you even when you're stubborn as a mule. Caleb laughed. I was going to say the same about you. They danced on while around them their family and friends celebrated a love that had started with a desperate act of kindness and grown into something unshakable. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new sorrows. Caleb's brother Robert died in 1906, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 59. Helen followed him 2 years later. Samuel and Ruth had 5 children who filled the ranch with new energy and chaos. The ranch itself had grown to 2,000 acres, one of the largest operations in southern Arizona. The right name meant something now. It meant honesty and hard work and keeping your word. When Caleb rode into Fort Benson, men tipped their hats. When Grace went shopping, shopkeepers gave her the best cuts of meat and the freshest produce. They had earned their place in this harsh land. They had survived drought and fire and enemies who sought their destruction. They had built something that would last. In 1923, Fort Benson celebrated its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. Caleb, now 92, was asked to speak at the ceremony as one of the oldest surviving pioneers. He stood on a makeshift stage in the town square, looking out at faces young and old, and told them about the Arizona he had known as a young man. It was harder than he said, his voice still strong despite his age. Harder and more dangerous. But it was also simpler in some ways. You knew who your friends were, you knew who you could trust, and you knew that your word was your bond. After the ceremony, his great-grandson Thomas found him sitting in the shade, that old pocket watch in his weathered hands. Grandpa Caleb, whose watch is that? The boy asked. Caleb looked at the watch, then at his great-grandson. It belonged to a man named Silas Garrett, a man who made a lot of mistakes but found his way to redemption in the end. Why do you carry it? To remember that people can change, that it's never too late to make things right. He handed the watch to Thomas. I want you to have it. You're shipping out to the war tomorrow, and I want you to carry something that reminds you that mercy is stronger than hate. Thomas took the watch, his eyes solemn. I'll take good care of it. I know you will. That night back at the ranch, Caleb sat on the porch with Grace. They were both old, now their bodies marked by 9 decades of hard living. But their hands still found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Thomas leaves tomorrow, Grace said softly. I know. I worry about him. This war in Europe, it's so far away, so different from anything we've known. He'll be Amundauhan. He's got right blood in him, stubborn and tough. Caleb squeezed her hand, just like his great-grandmother. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you ever think about that day, the day you saw me on Main Street? Every day. Do you ever regret it? Caleb turned to look at his wife, this woman who had saved him as surely as he had saved her. Not for 1 second. You gave me everything, Grace. A family, a purpose, a reason to keep living. I was dead inside before you came along. You saved me first, she reminded him. Then we're even. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Somewhere in the house, their grandchildren were putting younger children to bed. Samuel and Ruth were checking on the livestock. Their ranch continued its eternal rhythms. Caleb felt tired, more tired than he had ever felt in his long life. But it was a good tired, the tiredness of a job well done. I love you, he said to Grace. I've loved you since that first day, even though I didn't know it yet. I know, she said. I've always known. That night, Caleb Wright died peacefully in his sleep, Grace's hand in his. He was 92 years old and had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was the largest Fort Benson had ever seen. People came from across Arizona to pay their respects to a man who had embodied the best of the pioneering spirit. Grace stood at the graveside, dry-eyed and straight-backed, and watched them lower her husband into the ground. She didn't cry. Caleb wouldn't have wanted tears. He would have wanted her to celebrate the life they had shared. She lived 5 more years, dying in her sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In those 5 years, she told stories about Caleb to anyone who would listen, about the day he had offered his spare room to a stranger, about their rushed wedding to stop gossip, about how he had learned to love again after thinking his heart was dead. The Wright Ranch continued for generations after them. Samuel passed it to his eldest son. That son passed it to his daughter. Each generation added something new while honoring what had come before. In the Fort Benson Cemetery, two simple headstones stood side by side. Caleb Wright, 1831 to 1923, beloved husband, father, grandfather Grace Morgan Wright, 1856 to 1928, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Years later, someone added a bronze plaque at the base. Together, they built a legacy of love that spanned generations. Their story reminds us that courage, compassion, and second chances can transform lives and create something eternal. Thomas Wright returned from the war in 1919, carrying Silas Garrett's pocket watch in his uniform pocket. He had survived battles in France that killed thousands, but he never forgot his great-grandfather's lesson about mercy being stronger than hate. He took over the ranch in 1928 after Grace's death and ran it with the same integrity Caleb had shown. He told his own children about Caleb and Grace, about the gunshot on Main Street and the eviction and the offer of a spare room that changed everything. Those children told their children, and those children told theirs. The story of Caleb and Grace became family legend passed down through the generations. Each telling added new details, but the core remained the same. A lonely cowboy saw a woman in distress and offered help without expecting anything in return. A desperate young woman took a chance on a stranger's kindness. Two wounded souls found healing in each other. Together they built a life from nothing but hope and hard work, turning a chance meeting on a dusty street into a love story that would echo through generations. The Wright Ranch still operates today, a testament to what two people can build when they choose courage over fear, compassion over hatred, and love over loneliness. The land they fought so hard to protect still produces cattle. The water from Crystal Creek still flows. And somewhere in the ranch house in a glass case sits a gold pocket watch that belonged to a man who learned that redemption is always possible. Because in the end, that's what the story of Caleb and Grace teaches us. It's not about perfect people making perfect choices. It's about flawed human beings choosing to be better, to help, when they could ignore, to love, when they could hate, to build, when it would be easier to tear down. It's about second chances. For a widower who thought his life was over. For a young woman accused and abandoned. For an enemy who became a friend. For all of us who have ever needed grace and found it in unexpected places. The sun sets over the Wright Ranch much as it did that August evening in 1878 when Caleb first brought Grace home. The mountains still rise purple in the distance. The desert still blooms after rain. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, some say you can still hear an old man's voice telling a young soldier about the day he met a green-eyed girl on Main Street and decided to offer his spare room and eventually his heart. That decision, made in a moment of compassion on a sweltering afternoon, rippled forward through time, touching lives that wouldn't exist for decades, creating a legacy that outlasted stone and steel. This is what love does. It reaches beyond the grave. It builds futures. It transforms not just the lovers, but everyone they touch. Caleb and Grace understood this even if they couldn't articulate it. They knew that what they built together was bigger than themselves. And so the story ends where it began, with an old man and a young soldier and a gold pocket watch that represented both the worst of human nature and the best. Thomas Wright went to war, carrying that watch, survived, came home, and lived to tell his own grandchildren about the great-grandparents who had built an empire on kindness. The Wright name still means something in Arizona. It means integrity and hard work and keeping your promises. It means treating people with dignity even when they don't deserve it. It means believing in second chances and redemption. All because one lonely cowboy chose to help one desperate woman on one August afternoon in 1878. Some call it fate. Some call it providence. Some call it luck. Caleb and Grace called it the best decision they ever made.